Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about the RTX 5080 and we're going to be comparing it to the RTX 3080. You may ask, why aren't you comparing it to the RTX 4080 Super? Why aren't you comparing it to the size of my wiener? Or even the RTX 4080, like most 5080 reviews will do? Well, most gamers don't really upgrade their GPUs every year. For most gamers, a more realistic approach would be to compare it to a GPU they're thinking about upgrading. Now the 3080 came out in 2020, so it's about 5 years old now. And back then it was a pretty high-end card. We're gonna do some benchmarks, we're gonna do some gaming to see what kind of performance increase you get if you were to upgrade your 3080 to a 5080. So sit back, relax, adjust your sack. It's going to be pretty sicko mode. So before we get started, please like and subscribe. It really helps me out. If you have any questions, please leave it in the comments below. And every video I post will be more sicko mode than the last. All right, let's get to it. First things first, let's talk about the specs of these GPUs. All right, 5080 versus 3080. And I'm going to be comparing the Founders Editions of these cards. And the reason why we're testing out the Founders Editions cards is because these are the cards that I have. So that's what we're doing. All right, so comparing the MSRP, the 3080 was about $699, while the 5080 was $300 more at $999. So a $300 price jump. The 3080 came with 10 gigs of GDDR6X RAM, while the 5080 has 16 gigs of GDDR7 RAM. The number of AI TOPS has significantly improved. You may ask, what is AI TOPS? Well, TOPS stands for trillions of operations per second, and it's a metric used to measure the computational power of AI hardware. So basically, the more top you get, the more better. The 3080 was using DLSS2, while the 5080 is now using DLSS4. Clock speeds on the 5080 have significantly improved at 2.62 GHz versus 1.71 on the 3080. Definitely a lot of power is being used by both cards. And remember, with great power
comes
great responsibility.
I was going to stick with bitches, but if you want to be a virgin for the rest of your life.
The 5080 is at 380 watts, while the 3080 was at 320 watts. As I mentioned earlier, the 5080 was released in 2025, while the 3080 was released back in 2020. So back in 2020, if you were able to get your hands on an RTX 3080, you would have definitely been one of the coolest guys in town. I say that because it was so hard to get these cards. Not only did you have to compete with all the new PC gamers because of COVID, Bitcoin miners were buying up these cards and hoarding them like they were gold. And to top it all off, there were resellers buying these cards using bots and reselling them for crazy amounts of money. Pretty crazy time to buy a GPU. Although I did manage to snag a Founders Edition 3080, so it wasn't impossible to get these cards, but it was near impossible. But is it time to upgrade your 3080? Before we find that out, let's talk about the build that I have it in. Obviously, we're using the Founders Edition 5080 and the 3080. Both these cards are going to be paired with a Ryzen 7 7800X3D. It's on a Gigabyte B650 Aorus Elite motherboard, 32 gigs of DDR5 5600 Corsair Dominator RAM, 1TB WD Black NVMe SSD. Cooling the CPU is the nzxt Kraken Z73 water cooler. It's being powered by an EVGA 850-watt power supply, and it's all inside of the nzxt H9 Elite case. So overall, it's a pretty sick looking build. Some may say it looks pretty sicko mode. So let's start with benchmarks, and the first benchmark we ran was Cinebench. Just like the 5070 in my last video, for some reason Cinebench still doesn't support the 5080. I guess this makes the 5080 trash. Just kidding, moving on. And then the next tests I ran were 3D Mark benchmark tests, starting with Firestrike Extreme. 5080 scored significantly better than the 3080, about a 76% increase in performance. Now that's a pretty big jump. Moving on to the Time Spy benchmark, the gap wasn't as large, about a 60% increase in performance by the 5080, so still a pretty good jump in performance. Moving on to the Port Royal test, this test primarily focuses on ray tracing. There was a crazy 93% increase in performance. I hope this translates into actual gaming. Moving on to the Steel Nomad GPU benchmark test, there was about a 94% increase in performance when going with the 5080. And the final 3D Mark benchmark test we ran was Speedway, and there was about an 88% increase in performance when going with the 5080. Dang. Pretty healthy increases in performance when it comes to just the benchmarks. Now, how does that translate into gaming? Is this 5080 just going to blow the 3080 out of the water? Or is it going to completely bend over the 3080? First game I ran was Cyberpunk. 1440p ray tracing on. The 5080 made this game look like a piece of cake, while on the 3080 the game was very playable. However, I wouldn't say that the 3080 had an easy time doing it. As far as average FPS goes, the 5080 had about a 63% increase in FPS. Moving on to 1440p ultra settings without ray tracing, the RTX 3080 was much more comfortable, averaging 100 FPS, while the 5080 was averaging 175 FPS. So great FPS on a game that's actually still pretty GPU demanding, but the 5080 still had a 75% increase in performance. Moving on to 1080p ultra settings with ray tracing on, both GPUs handled these settings without issue. There was about a 54% increase in performance when going with the 5080, and at 1080p ultra settings without ray tracing, both these GPUs made this game look like it was a non-AAA title. The next game I ran was Starfield. 1440p ultra settings. This game is known to make even high-end PCs struggle for FPS. However, the 5080 didn't struggle at all. The 1% and 0.1% lows never dipped below 60 FPS, which is pretty impressive for Starfield. The 3080 was at 67, 57, and 48, so there was about a 66% increase in FPS when going with the 5080, but honestly the 3080's numbers are still pretty solid, for Starfield that is. And at 1080p ultra settings, the 5080 was about a 51% increase in performance, but the 3080 still did a pretty good job for being a 5-year-old card. And here's some actual gameplay of Starfield, and as you can see, both cards are actually playing it pretty well, even though Starfield is notorious for making decent GPUs struggle. After that, we ran Hogwarts Legacy. Once again, this is a pretty GPU demanding game. 1440p ultra settings with ray tracing on. The gap was significantly closer than the previous two games at only 15%. 1% and 0.1% lows, not the greatest, but honestly, both GPUs handle this game no problem, even with ray tracing on. And with ray tracing off, there was about a 22% increase in FPS with the 5080, and surprisingly, the 0.1% lows on the 3080 was actually better than the 5080. But still, the difference of 4 FPS isn't that much. The gap narrows even further with 1080p ultra settings with ray tracing on, only about an 8% increase in average FPS. 1080p ultra settings without ray tracing, both GPUs pretty much manhandled this game, and there was about 11% increase in performance with the 5080. That's not that much at all. The next test I ran was a test to see which GPU would fit better up your butt.
What?
Just kidding, I wanted to see if you guys were still paying attention. The next game I ran was Red Dead Redemption 2. 1440p ultra settings. For this game being about 7 years old, this game still looks really good, and it still requires a decent PC to play it. Neither of the GPUs dipped below 60 FPS when it comes to the 0.1% lows. The 5080 had about a 73% increase in average FPS. However, 90 FPS is nothing to complain about with the 3080. Going down to 1080p, the performance increase was about 43% when it comes to average FPS, and 1% lows and 0.1% lows were phenomenal with both cards. Moving on to the next game, I decided to test a different game, Star Wars Jedi Survivor. 1440p ultra settings with ray tracing on. Both GPUs had pretty healthy average FPS numbers, and there was about a 36% increase in performance with the 5080. Now at 1440p ultra settings with ray tracing off, the performance difference increased to about 61%. The 5080 nearly got 200 FPS at 195. Still, 122 is nothing to worry about with the 3080. Now at 1080p ultra settings with ray tracing on, the performance difference was much closer, only about a 10% increase in performance. And with ray tracing off, it was about a 17% increase in performance. Alright, I know talking about numbers can get pretty boring, so as an intermission, I'm going to show you a video of my boy Klaus eating some Twinkies. Moving on, then I ran Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 1440p ultra settings with ray tracing on. Both these GPUs played this game as if they were a big truck, and they accidentally ran over a small kid, They barely felt anything. So pretty healthy numbers, 240 FPS on the 5080, 131 on the 3080, but that was an 83% increase in performance. A 72% increase in performance when ray tracing was off, 62% at 1080p ultra settings with ray tracing on, and about 45% with 1080p at ultra settings. Like I said, these GPUs didn't feel anything. And the final game I ran was GTA 5. This is the enhanced version, so we are dealing with better graphics and ray tracing, 1440p ultra settings. There was about a 21% increase in performance with the 5080. However, for some reason 1% and 0.1% lows were much higher on the 3080. Moving on to 1080p, the gap narrows. It's about a 16% increase in performance with the 5080, but honestly there was no issue with either GPU. Now I'm going to show you some 1440p gameplay. It was definitely a nice day at the beach with both cards. But if you see the 3080, it is dipping below 100 FPS, which isn't bad. It's just about 60 FPS behind the 5080. So there's definitely been a big improvement with ray tracing with the 5080. So after all those benchmarks, after all that gaming, what does this actually all mean?
What does it mean? What does it mean?
That means you're gay.
Not quite. Okay, let's break this down. Both cards are pretty high-end cards for their time. The aging 3080 is about to be 5 years old, and the 5080 has proven that in benchmarks, it completely blows the 3080 out of the water. The 5080 has more VRAM at 16 gigs versus 10 gigs, which not only attracts gamers, but also people who use GPUs for workstation stuff. The 5080 also has newer DLSS technology, which gives you better FPS, especially when playing newer AAA titles. Now in Cyberpunk, we saw increases in performance by as much as 75% at 1440p, and with ray tracing on, it was about a 63% increase. Starfield was about a 66% increase. However, Hogwarts Legacy and Jedi Survivor didn't see as much of an increase in performance at 1080p, being as low as only 8% better and only 16% better with GTA 5, the enhanced version, at 1440p with ray tracing on. Games like Red Dead Redemption 2 and Shadow of the Tomb Raider saw as much as a 73% increase in FPS and an 83% increase in FPS with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This just means that all games aren't the same. Some are GPU heavy games and some are CPU heavy games. But anyways, going back to the point of this video, is it worth the upgrade to upgrade your 3080 to a 5080? Me personally, I'm gonna say no. Yeah, sure, we got crazy increase in performance in benchmarks and gaming, but is it worth dropping another $1,000 to get these increases in performance? Let's be real. The performance you still get out of the RTX 3080 is still pretty phenomenal. It can handle any AAA title you throw at it. Can it handle any esport title? Of course. Some of those games you can run on a toaster. Even though the RTX 3080 is 5 years old, which is pretty old when it comes to technology, it is still a very capable card. Also, when the 3080 came out, this was a crazy improvement over the previous generation. I'm talking almost 50% better than the previous 2080 Super. Now, how much better is the 5080 over the 4080 Super? It's only about 8 to 17% faster, according to Google Gemini. What the hell, nvidia? Honestly, I think the 30 series GPUs were some of the greatest increases in performances we've seen, only second to the increase in performance from the 980 Ti to the 1080 Ti, which was 60 to 70% faster. That's a big ass improvement. So if you have a 3080, keep rocking it. If you have money to blow, sure, why not? Upgrade. You can put the 3080 in a secondary PC, or give it to someone less fortunate than you. But unless you're gonna be playing games in 4K, I really don't see a reason why you would upgrade your 3080. Now, there are reasons why you should buy a 5080. Yes, the performance increase over the 4080 Super isn't that much, but in 2025, you can't really get a 4080 Super at MSRP anymore. So if you're building a new build from scratch, and your GPU budget is $1,000, well, it makes sense to buy the 5080. If you already have a 4080 and a 4080 Super, obviously the 5080 would be a really bad purchase. But yeah, upgrading your 3080 to a 5080 is not something I would recommend just yet. Let me know what you guys think, and also, is it worth it to upgrade to a 5080 from your current GPU? And please like and subscribe, it really helps me out. Me and my boys Klaus and Josh Allen work really hard to make every video as sicko mode as possible. And like always, have a sicko mode day.